Hey everyone, my name is Corell, and today, after our last discussion of damage types and effects, we're going to be talking about how to resist those. We're going to get into the mechanics of armor, how best to armor your vehicles, and some more interesting esoteric armor designs. So let's go ahead and hop right in. To start off with, I've got this test platform here. This is going to have a bunch of different types of damage on them. We're probably going to neglect a couple of these over here that are less interesting in our testing, but let's just go ahead and go through these real quick. Over on the left, I've got a high AP kinetic shell that has a lot of armor piercing, but trades off some kinetic damage for it. Next, we've got a low AP kinetic shell that has less armor piercing, more kinetic damage. We've got an EMP shell. We have a HESH shell, or a high explosive shell with a squash head. We've got a heat shell, which is a high explosive head with a, what do you call it here? The shaped charge head on it. And we've got an impact shell, which is the hollow point head on a kinetic shell. And then we've got a pure HE shell. This is just as ludicrous as you can possibly make an HE shell that will fit in this gun. Yeah, these are all at 150 millimeters, so we'll set this for that. And these are the maximum size that will actually fit in these cannons. Each of these cannons will fire 2 of these shells, and I've got these set up on control groups so that I can control each cannon individually or groupings of cannons based on their type. So, that aside, let's go ahead and look at our armor test setup. Over here we've got kind of a control block. This is kind of a demonstration block just to show you what we're looking at as far as each of these tests. This one's got 2 layers of metal, so we've got an armor class of 30 at the front edge, 15 at the back. Each of these metal beams, of course, has the standard 2100 health, and back here we've got a bunch of AI PIDs. These are serving as kind of our test metric. So once we punch through the front layer of armor in each of these blocks, we're going to see how many and how many of these get destroyed and how many shots it takes to do so in the first place. So let's go ahead and start taking a look. I'm just going to walk through these cannons one at a time. I'm going to give them a test shot, and we will see what the results are. So over here we have the high AP kinetic shell. You fire that, each shot breaks 1 block, or 1 beam. Second shot will break through this and start dealing damage to the blocks behind it. So we managed to break through there, and we dealt damage immediately to the AI PIDs back here. Our second cannon up is the high kinetic damage, medium armor pierce one. I say medium armor pierce because this has more than 0 armor piercing on it. It's about 24-25 based on the shell. We've got 25 armor pierce there. So firing this, looks like both of those shells hit the same line of beams, and this time, as you'd expect, they punched all the way through and hit the PIDs behind. Next up we have the EMP shell, and this one I'm expecting to do a ton of damage here, because this is very vulnerable. There's no EMP resistance anywhere in this. So that broke a lot of blocks. Next we will go on to the high explosive types, and we'll first look at a HESH cannon shell here. So I've repaired up the target so we can see what's going on here, and the next shell up is HESH. So we're just going to fire a shot here. You can see that spewed some particles out the back, and we got a bunch of AI PIDs blocks being broken there. Next we'll take a look at heat. I'm going to aim this a little, over this way. Let's just go ahead and take a shot here and see what happens. Again, we broke through there easily, and we dealt a bunch of damage to those AI PIDs back there. And let's go to the impact. This is probably one of the less interesting shell types. It just doesn't deal a whole lot of damage in this particular cannon form factor. When you start dealing with impact shells, you really want those to be as large as possible. So you can see there we're dealing damage to the first layer of metal. We're not even breaking it because the amount of armor piercing and kinetic damage there is not sufficient to break even 1 beam. So yeah, kind of anemic. We're probably not going to pay a whole lot of attention to this cannon. Likewise, the HE over here will eventually break through pretty much anything, but it will take a large number of shots. You can see there we dealt very little damage in a very large area. So hitting the outside of armor here is not really what HE cannons are designed for, but you want to make sure that your armor class is high enough and that your armor designs are resistant to HE regardless, if only so that HE shots don't destroy your vehicle. So now that we've inspected our test platform, let's go ahead and talk about some of the general principles of armor layout. First off, the purpose of armor as a whole is to prevent damage for other components. Your armor itself has no purpose on its own, it just contributes health to the vehicle without really doing anything. So you don't want to overuse armor, and likewise you don't want to armor things that don't need to be protected. So throwing armor in non-critical areas of your vehicle, probably not the greatest idea. You add a fair amount of expense here when you start talking about reasonably thick armor, and it just doesn't do a whole lot for you. There are other considerations beyond simple protection, though. Armor can also help you minimize drag, and there's a lot of other things you need to pay attention to when you're talking about designing your armor. You want to minimize the weight of the armor, you want to minimize the cost of the armor, you want to make sure that your armor is both easy and cheap to repair. Those are both important factors. And you also kind of want it to look nice. You don't want to have some clunky monstrosity on the outside of your vehicle just in order to protect yourself. So that out of the way, there are some general principles that help you accomplish this. One of the most important is the trade-off that you make when dealing with armor volume. Very thin layers of armor you can make very effective or very powerful by using something like heavy armor. But heavy armor is expensive, it's not very efficient as far as the stats that you get out of it per material that you put in. It doesn't look the best in the world, but it's thin, and that has a lot of things going for it. So yeah, there's a trade-off there. Likewise, you can make an armor layout like some of these over here that are actually better than heavy armor in every measurable aspect. However, these are thick. They're 4 blocks thick just in the armor layer, and that's not necessarily going to be conducive for an armor layout where you need to, minimize drag on a small vehicle, for instance, or minimize weight for an aircraft, stuff like that. So the armor layout that you want to use is as individual as every vehicle you make. There is no magic bullet for armor layout. That being said, we're going to get some of these armor layouts that I think perform very well, and we'll inspect what makes them tick. Another thing you want to always look at is to always, always, always use beams. The blocks here have a set amount of health. Beams have a linearly increasing percentage health bonus per beam length, so you always want to use the longest beam possible just because of the amount of extra health it gives you. Another consideration you want to make is to always cross-hatch your armor layout whenever possible. And cross-hatching is a technique or term that I came up with. It's not really officially invented or anything, but basically what I mean there is to change the direction that your armor beams flow. So in one case I might have 4 armor beams like so. In the next I'm going to turn them sideways. And what that means is if I was to shoot this with say a kinetic shell, and hit this hard enough to pierce through it. If you have over here beams that are parallel to each other, say if I have 4 here and 4 here in the same orientation, if I was to shoot one of these and puncture all the way through it, I now have a 1x4 hole in my armor. Over here, if I was to puncture 2 of these blocks in a row, I have a 1x1 hole. The rest of the armor might be slightly weaker, but it has served its purpose and is still keeping out the vast majority of incoming projectiles. A lot of things in the game do not pierce armor very well. Explosions don't, frag particles don't, anything that is not really intended to pierce armor generally won't. Therefore, when you minimize the size of the hole through your armor, even once the armor is broken, the armor is still largely able to accomplish its purpose, even though it might have had a minor failure at some point. So I always like to lay my armor out kind of in this alternating pattern, and that helps keep things kind of protected as much as possible in from the depths. Another principle of armor design here is having an air gap between layers of armor. If I was to hit these 2 layers of armor with HESH or heat, as you saw over there, it will blow straight through those 2 layers of armor, spawn particles on the inside, and those will proceed into my vehicle to destroy everything that should not be destroyed. So I don't want that. By adding an air gap in here, and then placing another layer of armor, or adding non-structural components in here, I can force the particles to spawn in that gap, and then hit this spall liner in the back. And this will probably resist those particles and do a pretty good job at making sure that they don't get into the vehicle proper. So some sort of spall liner is very important when you're dealing with more advanced cannon shell types. Now, obviously, there's still a bunch of types that can penetrate this, like with an APHE or armor-piercing high explosive with a fuse that's set to go off at a specific penetration depth and enough armor-piercing to punch through these. But you can't protect against everything, and this does a pretty good job at protecting most types of things. Note too that I said that you can use non-structural components in this air gap. That includes, oddly enough, a type of armor. Applique panels fit really nicely in here because they can stop particle spawn, or rather they can force particles to still spawn in this gap, while still providing a measurable amount of defense in the air gap. Now, I've already talked about armor stacking at length, so you'll realize that this means that having these applique panels in here actually does not contribute armor class forwards. That's not necessarily a good thing, but it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world either. There's a limit to how much armor class will get you. You can contribute to that using ring shields or other techniques as well, so very often it's still to your advantage, even though you're losing out on potential armor class, to have something like these in here, just to kind of help mitigate the particles that are inevitably going to make it past your armor, or your primary armor, I should say. So, another technique we can use here is EMP resistance. So assume for a moment that the bottom of this platform here doesn't exist, and we just have this chunk of armor. If I was to replace one of these entire layers with stone here, you would think that this would be very EMP resistant, right? Because if I was to strike the outside of this barrier with EMP, it couldn't find a route in. You would be incorrect. The EMP will still get through that because the stone has a protective drainage of 100 units. That means it will drain 100 units of EMP off of a shell, or missile, or whatever is hitting you. However, this particular gun shell over here has 1700 EMP strength. 1600 of that is still going to make it right past your armor layout because it's going to find one of these blocks, pass through it, and jump to the applique panel. These are still adjacent blocks, even though they're technically not touching. So what you're getting there is you're still going to get EMP blow-through. There's a way around this, however, by simply putting a block, a conductive block, kind of crossing that bridge. So I can bridge that gap. Now, before, the protective drainage of this would mean that it's a very unattractive thing for EMP to try and propagate through, but if there is no other option, it will still go straight through it. It will drain 100 units of EMP damage away, but it will still go through. However, if we were to put a beam across the gaps like this, and we were to put a couple of surge protectors on here, the EMP damage will strike this and determine that the best way to get to components that are easy to destroy is to come through this short circuit. And along the way, there just happen to be surge protectors that can absorb that damage. So you want to have something like this in your armor layout somewhere. You want to have a path, a very obvious path for that EMP damage to travel down in order to reach these surge protectors, or have to travel past the surge protectors in order to reach more critical components. So that is probably the best way I've found of mitigating EMP, because it makes the EMP's travel paths very predictable. That helps you ensure that your critical components back here don't have to deal with the EMP ever, and that's what you want. So another principle of armor design here is that your outermost material is going to get destroyed the most often. So you want it to be both resistant to damage and cheap to repair. Personally, I find metal has the best mix of those properties. It's 20 materials to repair. That's not great, but it also has quite a lot of armor class behind it at 15, and it's got a fair amount of health behind it at 2100. Per beam, that is. So it's fairly resistant to damage. It's going to take a lot to punch through this. But if a block does get destroyed, it's 20 materials to repair. It's not the end of the world. So you've got a nice mix of resistance to damage and repairability. Likewise, you also want to minimize the number of blocks that are going to get destroyed with any given shot. So if I was to shoot this with, say, an explosive round and blow off a single block out here, then it would get repaired because there's one block to repair. It would not take your repair bots, your repair tentacles very long to repair that. If I was to, however, shoot this outside panel with an explosive round and all I had out here was stone, odds are it's going to take off more than one stone beam. So I end up repairing a lot more than one block. That consumes repair time, that consumes materials, and it means that potentially having a weaker armor layer on the outside means that you're spending a lot more time trying to fix the armor that's there rather than repairing that critical engine component that also got damaged. So you need to kind of make a balance between having your outer shell be very hard and difficult to hit and making sure that it's, going to be easy and cheap to repair. For that reason, heavy armor actually makes a terrible external component because it's 100 materials per beam. You would have to repair something like 5 metal beams before you match up to the cost of one heavy armor beam. And that's just not worth it. The stats it brings to the table are not worthwhile for that. So speaking of statistics, I've done a bunch of analysis and kind of done some math on the various different types of material, and there's a few interesting standouts here. And I'm going to tell you what these are. I'm not going to tell you how to use them. That can be left up to your own judgment, I think. So the standout materials here are wood. For the first one, we've got stupidly cheap beams. They cost 4. So you've got 270 hit points per material. That is by far and away the highest hit points of any material in the game as far as armor goes. That is definitely a standout. But you've also got 0.75 armor class per material. Now that's tied for second with metal and decking. I'm going to talk about decking in a moment, but for a moment let's go ahead and talk about metal. Metal is at 105 hit points per material. It's way worse than wood. However, metal is also way denser than wood. Metal has 2100 hit points per metal beam. A wooden beam over here only has 1080. So it would take 2 wooden beams to make up the health hit point pool of a single layer of metal, but you wouldn't get anything like the armor class. You only get 3 armor out of that, and if you stack 2 of them together, you would get 6 at the front layer compared to metal's 15. The metal is much, much more likely to resist small arms fire, and medium arms fire for that matter, especially if it's layered. So yes, you could just stack a ton of wooden beams on the outside of your vehicle. That will give your armor a ton of hit points. However, that's going to make your armor extremely thick, and we go back to our secondary considerations here. That's going to cause a lot of drag, it's going to be difficult to repair, and it's going to be difficult to make that look good. So, not necessarily, while wood itself, if you just stack tons and tons and tons of wood, might be some of the most protective armor in the game, it's the secondary considerations kind of kill it for that. Wood can definitely have its place in even a heavy stacked armor layout, but you need to be a little careful about how you use it. Another standout here is stone. Stone is actually the second highest hit points per material spend. Well, it's tied for the second highest, I should say, but it also has much higher armor class than the other second highest. So stone is an excellent material for a backing material because it's got a lot of hit points, it takes a lot of effort to work your way through it, it's got a decent armor class on it, and if stacked with other armor, that 7 armor is going to make a substantial difference. It's very noticeable. It's not just something that's going to be kind of there in the background, but might be like a 10% damage reduction or something. No, stone is going to produce a very appreciable damage reduction if you have that stacked in a thick armor layout. So combine that with its high health pool and its relatively cheap material cost, just a little bit over half of the cost of the metal beam, stone is actually a pretty good armoring material. Likewise, we have decking here. Decking is a hybrid of wood or metal. It has the armor class per material tied with wood and metal, but its hit points are 132.5 hit points per material spend. Metal has only 105, wood has 270. So decking is far more trending towards the wood end of things, or the metal end of things as far as the hit point pool goes. But its other stats are half and half, exactly halfway between metal and wood. So you're losing out on some stuff there, and overall I'm just not a huge fan of this material because of that. It's just not particularly efficient in any one category. That being said, it's very useful for getting very tough armor that looks like wood. So if you're going for a wood aesthetic, again, that's a secondary consideration that you need to take into account. Likewise, as a backing material, it's not that bad. It's got 9 armor, which beats out even stone. And the 4 meters of reinforced decking is actually the same cost as stone, so if you need to contribute armor class forwards, this is a better way to do it than stone, if all you care about is the armor class. Moving on, one of the other standouts here is applique. Applique panels are the lowest hit points by a huge margin. Even rubber does better than this in terms of hit point pool. What it does have is 5.42 armor class per material. That's like 6 or 7 times more than 7 times in fact, the next highest armor class per material, which is 0.75. So applique has incredible armor class. Only downside is you can't stack it. There's no way of stacking this on top of the armor class of anything else. It just kind of exists in its own little vacuum. It still has great uses because that armor class will almost entirely mitigate explosive damage. So things that try and punch through your armor and explode inside, this is a great way of mitigating that. Likewise, applique is actually an excellent way of lining explosive boxes. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Another standout here is heavy armor. This is a standout because it is terrible. Don't use this stuff. It is not good. Heavy armor has the lowest hit points almost of any type of material, per cost that is. It has 60 hit points per material spent. The only thing worse than that is rubber at 50 hit points, and that's not a huge difference. So you're also getting 0.4 armor class per material out of this, and it's extremely heavy. 200 weight per volume. That's 200 weight for a single block of this. So it's incredibly inefficient. It's not something you want to use if there is any other choice for armoring in the current scenario. So I've given you a lot of information and statistics here. Let's see how it actually plays out. So I've shown you kind of what the various cannons do against this very simple armor layout over here, and just for demonstration purposes, I've also got a heavy armor block here, and we're going to demonstrate these cannons against this. We're going to do so all at once, because I can fire all of these cannons at once, and we're just going to kind of show off what this does. So if I aim all of these cannons at the same time and pull the trigger, you can see the armor held up. It did not get punctured even by the kinetic rounds, but the insides of this thing are still a mess. The HESH and HE, or heat rather, both pierced through this and dealt a ton of damage on the inside. So this single layer of heavy armor is not effective armor. Couple that with the fact that I really don't like how heavy armor looks, and you just end up with an armor layout that is not really my favorite. This is not something I want on my vehicle. Oh yes, and the other problem with the heavy armor block, it sinks. All of the other armor block demonstrations that I have here are at least neutrally buoyant. Even the metal over there can be supported by the lightness of the AI PIDs that are attached back there. This one just sinks. The heavy armor is too heavy to be overcome. Not what you want. Anyway, moving along. Over here we have the first of our real armor demonstrations. And this is metal on the outside, stone on the inside, applique on the inside of that, and light armor on the inside of that. Now, this is, you would think, fairly effective armor, and you'd be right. One thing that will go through it without question, though, is EMP. Remember what I said about the short circuit over there? We do not have one of those on these. Now, in order to show you what that can do with and without the short circuit, I'm going to fire a couple of shots at this with just the EMP selected, and we're going to see how this works. So right now I don't have the short circuit in. I shoot with EMP, and I get a major blow through. Let's go ahead and get this repaired up, and I'll install the short circuit down here, and we'll see what that does. Alright, so I repaired this armor up here back up, and I installed a short circuit down here. What this will do is short circuit the outer metal layer to the inner alloy layer, and along the way we've got these nice surge protectors in here to kind of soak up EMP damage. The PIDs back there have been repaired, so we'll just take another test shot with this. Now you can see we dealt a bunch of EMP damage there. It came down to these and got completely absorbed. No interior damage was taken. Now obviously this EMP resistance is exactly what we want, so I'm not going to test this EMP cannon anymore, simply because we can, in every case, completely negate it with the addition of that tiny extension. So we're just going to assume that that exists from here on out, and in order to shorten testing, we're just going to ignore that cannon for the next armor segments. Moving on, we have our kinetic tests. Let's go ahead and run over here, and we'll fire off our first high AP, low kinetic damage kinetic shells. Now you can see our cross-hatched armor layout is doing its job here. We managed to punch through the outer metal, through one layer of stone. The projectiles hit the applique and stopped there. Even this high of a armor pierce here is not, 130 that it would have to be in order to pierce applique's health without reduction. So yeah, even this very strong shell, or fairly strong high armor pierce shell, isn't going to go through applique without a fight. So our applique liner in there did stop the projectiles. Let's go ahead and take another shot, and this is probably going to blow through if I hit my target correctly. Yeah, and you can see we are through and starting to deal damage to the internals. So I'm going to repair that up, and we'll move on to our high kinetic, low AP shell. Alright, so starting off with our high kinetic, low AP shell, we can again see that it has nearly identical performance here, and this is generally going to be a recurring theme. We're going to see this happen over and over again on almost every armor layout we test with this. The one difference is we hit that second shot a little bit better, and it managed to pierce the rear armor beam as well, and just skipped its way right on through. So yeah, fairly effective. But with our cross-hatched armor layout, we still only got a 1x1 hole. Let's get this repaired up, and we'll move on to the next test. Next up, we have a Hesh cannon. We're just going to give this a shot here. Now you can see that managed to blow through, but it didn't do a whole lot of damage behind there. We took out 4 AI PIDs, and it looks like there's an applique panel floating in the water as well. So that tells me that the Hesh managed to blow through and probably spawn some particles in on the applique, and it looks like probably spawn them on the far side of this light alloy here as well. We dealt some damage back there, but not a ton. Next cannon type I'd like to demonstrate is heat, and we're just going to fire this here. And you can see that we managed to blow a light alloy beam off back there and deal some damage with the rest of that shell to some of these components back here. Again, we didn't take out too many PID blocks, certainly nothing like the heavy armor demonstration or the twin metal layered armor demonstration, but we still dealt some damage there. So I'm going to go ahead and get that repaired up. And again, let's go ahead and demonstrate the impact, and HE cannons are going to do next to nothing, exactly as you'd expect. it would take these somewhere between 5 and 6 shots to make their way through this armor. These particular cannons just do not support the size or complexity of shell necessary to make this particular type of thing work against armor. That's especially true for the impact. With HE, those shells would still be devastatingly effective if I was able to get them into this confined space between the armor and the critical internal components over here. HE is at its best when it's exploding in a confined space, remember, so you always want to try and keep HE out of confined spaces. The next layout of armor I've got here is basically, it's the same 4 different types of blocks here. Again, I'm using the standout materials of each type in order to try and make this work. You could, in theory, reverse the metal and alloy here if you want a less radar detectable material, but let's be real here. You've got a 4 thick armor layer. If you put this over much of anything critical, your vehicle is going to be huge and you're going to be detected on radar. There's no getting around that. That being said, at least the light alloy might help you a little bit with making it easier to decoy radar-guided missiles away from you. Still, moving on, the actual tests here are going to show that this is actually much more effective. Why is that? Well, you might understand from this that the armor class that we're stacking onto the front is much higher than the armor class down there. Here we have a layer of metal with 15 armor class and a layer of stone with 7. Means our outer armor class is 22. Here we've got, I believe this is 13 on light alloy. Yes, we have 13 armor class here and 15 out here. So we have a total of 28 armor class. That makes this armor much more resistant to initial bursts of damage. And due to heat and HESH mechanics, it also reduces some of their devastation that they can cause. However, back here we have stone. And that's kind of important. The stone is actually quite useful here. If we take a look at the health of a light alloy beam and the health of a stone beam, it's the same. But the stone beam is almost half the cost of the light alloy beam. So we have a very cheap inner layer that's not contributing as much armor class forwards anyway, but still has the same health. That's important because when you're talking about heat and HESH, those are going to produce particles that have a set armor piercing value. Those aren't going to have infinite armor pierce. HESH will do a lot better against this layout than heat would, but it will still get largely mitigated by this. So really what you're dealing with here, you're trying to maximize the health of the inner layer while minimizing its armor class per cost. So you don't really care about armor class here so much as so long as that armor class will resist the particles that are going to be spawned in here. You just care about it having enough health that it's not going to care about that. Likewise, if I'm trying to maximize my effective outer armor class per cost, I want this light alloy outside as close to the front as possible. So I've shifted those 2 layers here, and we'll just fire off some test shots and see what happens. If you'll remember, it took 2 shots from our kinetic cannons over here, and we'll just go ahead and replicate that test here with the high AP shell. So first off, it looks like we hit 2 layers of metal out there, and we'll just go ahead and fire another shot here. And you can see that that started to break through, and we in fact broke one inner component because that second shot hit all in the same spot. So again, 2 shots to break all the way through. That's pretty much identical performance to what we saw before. But this type of shell is not exactly what we were trying to resist. Remember, we're increasing the armor class at the outside. The high AP shell is going to ignore that armor class for the most part anyway. So let's fire off the low AP high kinetic shell. Again, this is going to punch through in the second one, just due to how the numbers work out. Second shot there is going to break through. Again, though we're still only breaking 1 block back there. And those aren't the most dangerous shell types to deal with. Still worth checking into and testing against, but these aren't necessarily the most devastating things in the world. So let's go ahead and take a shot with our heat and hesh. Let's go ahead and get just the hesh here. There we are. And let's go ahead and take a shot. That broke one beam of some sort on the inside. Hard to tell what that was exactly. Looks like applique maybe. And let's take one more shot in the same spot. That broke a metal beam on the outside but did nothing to the inside. Let's take a third shot. Come on, anytime now. Third shot, we broke another vertical beam. That was likely a stone beam on the inside. And let's go ahead and take a fourth. And this will likely end up... Yeah, there we hit onto the inside of the vehicle and started breaking components. But it took 4 shots for the hesh to break through. That's actually pretty good performance. Alright, so I've repaired up our test target, and now we're going to fire some heat shots in there. First shell, we managed to break one horizontal beam. Let's see what the second shot does. Anytime now. And our second shot manages to break through and start dealing damage to internals. Heat is almost always better against really thick armor like this, and it's generally going to just do better against that. But it still did take 2 shots for us to break through. That's similar for performance to what we got from this other block over here. Still nothing to write home about, but at least it took us 2 shots to get anything through, and those shots had to be lined up in the same spot. Keep in mind, if our shells were not shooting the exact same spot each time, they would not break through. Also keep in mind that we are actually firing 2 shells from each of these cannons simultaneously, so each of these is going to be kind of doubled up on its effects. Alright, so that's all I've got for you today. Hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope I'll see you next time.